B11. Isn't that why I'm here? To do a little bingo? No. So, awesome to see all of you here today. I'm not sure exactly what Brian said, because Lutheran world is very small. A couple weeks ago, I have a lake home in northern Minnesota. Any of you been in the beautiful holy land of northern Minnesota? Park Rapids, Minnesota. I have a lake home up there. I was in Rebel Brewery, microbrew, in downtown Park Rapids. And in walks this couple I haven't seen for a while. They're friends from the church in town. I know them for years. So I walk in this morning. There's Al. The last time I saw him was at Rebel Brewing in Park Rapids, Minnesota. And Al and Joe are here because they're the Judsons, the grandparents of your confirmand and your senior today. I'm looking at Al going, what the are you doing here? This is just, all the gin joints and all the world. So that is such a small world that Al and Joe are here on the one day, Sunday, that I'm here to do this, and their confirmation and graduation. So that was pretty cool. So we'll chat about you folks back in Park Rapids at Rebel Brewery. So here's what we're going to do this morning is all of you, or most of you on the Zoom, how many of you actually took the map? Very good. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It helps us to feel very confident in the data. So the map, the mission assessment profile, is an instrument we created that is designed to really help us. We always use this as the beginning point of our relationship with any client. So I'm sorry I have my other two companies. This is Kairos. It's a company that does development work. In fact, it's one of the reasons I got to know Al and Joe is I did a capital field for their church, Park Rapids. And that's Kairos. That does development, fundraising work. We do mostly with the LCA churches around the country. And then the other company is the Joshua Group. And the only apparel I have for that is a winter coat. So I was not going to be wearing that today if I sail yet. So we designed this, the Joshua Group and Kairos both use this instrument as the beginning point of a relationship so we can get a lay of the land in terms of how people are feeling, experiencing, valuing the mission, the ministry, what is their experience of it. And so this map is our quantitative way of gathering data to give us kind of a baseline that everything else then that we learn and discover can be done in reference to what we learned from this instrument. So my job today is to walk through with you what we learned from that, and then you can lift up questions. If I'm speaking gibberish and you're not understanding what I'm trying to explain, please raise your hand. I am Swedish after all, and we have trouble sometimes with logic. Okay, so this is the 3 points about this instrument. One, it is the beginning. It's not an end point like, look at what we learned, we know everything now. This is simply a beginning of discovery and discernment. It's not designed to tell you what to do. So we don't look at this and say, oh, now we learned this, and now we should go do that. It's kind of a way of identifying where's energy. Where might we best place resources effectively as we look at kind of the state of the culture. And it's an assessment of your ministry's current state and the perceptions of you who experience it, and it is not a judgment. Although there'll be times as we look at the numbers and the data that you might want to judge the culture, it's not about judgment as it is about giving us information and insight as to people's senses, values, and things like that. It's learning points, not judgments for it. So, a couple of things that's helpful to understand. We have demographic breakdown in different ways. The first thing is 182 people took it. Give yourselves a hand. That's awesome. That is a great result. What we try to do is we don't try to get every member. A friend of mine who was into doing a lot of these assessment tool designing, He said, you know, you go to the doctor, they don't have to take all of your blood to determine what kind of blood type you have. So, good news. We don't have to talk or see and hear from every single person, but if we feel like we've got a good snapshot of the representation of your culture, we feel very strong about the reliability of this data. And so with 182, that's very good, but we also want to know what were those 182? What do they look like? Well, 4% are under 30, 12 are between 30 and 45, 12 are between 46 and 60, and 72% are over 60. So if you look at the room, do you think we have 72% over age 60? Yes. So fairly accurate, I would say, to the culture, which is not good or bad, it just is what it is. You're a highly educated culture, which is good and a challenge. So as a consultant, I'd like to know how educated the culture is, not to know whether you're stupid or not. But here's the challenge with highly educated culture. You have 76% that at least have a college degree, 40% of those have masters. In the team that we put together for this leadership transition, how many of that team were teachers? Was it 4 of you, or who was there? I think there was, a lot of teachers, a lot of educated folks. So here's the challenge with that. Highly educated cultures like to talk a lot and struggle making decisions. So it's okay. They want to make sure every voice is heard, right? We want to make sure we're valuing opinions, insights, but it struggles then to finally put a line in the sand and say, well, we're going to make a decision here. And that's good to know as a consultant, because then I sometimes have to be the one to pick the leadership team, the leader, so we got to make a decision. So this is how your households break down for single parent families, empty nesters, those kinds of things. And we have 72% of you that have been here more than 10 years. Half of you have been here probably as long as Brian, or close to it, because you're over 20 years. And most of those have probably been here for a while. I think Amy, you were the longest tenured person, right? You were what, 49 years here? So who could be 49 on the leadership team? 49 years or more. Who's been here more than 49 years? What do you got?
53, 4.
Is that when you were born?
Thank you.
You're welcome. You owe me. Talk after. Okay. So remember, here's what's important to remember. Half of you have been here over 20 years. When you answer these questions, you don't always go to an immediate experience. Sometimes when you answer these statements, you think of a memory. These are real stories you're trying to be asked about, not some random thing. You have to go to an actual event, experience, person, whatever. So we want to be mindful of that. There might have been something influenced. For you, you have a long tenured pastor, so we're not thinking about, because sometimes if there's been a change of pastoral leadership and there was conflict or some dysfunction in that transition, that interim process, that can really weigh into the culture's understanding of itself for many, many years. But you've had Brian here for a while, so that's some real good continuity. The other demographic breakdown is attendance. So basically, everybody that took this, or nearly everybody, is somewhat active. I was a parish pastor for about 15, 16 years. And I remember early in my pastoral career that if I didn't see somebody, every week or every other week, I was concerned. They were like not active. Now it's if I see you once a month, you're an active person. That's changed dramatically. So once a month is considered somewhat active. You have pretty much everybody that took this, and that's good because you have an intimate experience of this culture that gives us better insight than someone who's just very, very distantly connected to the culture. 16% have children under 18. And that's a little lower than what we experience. It's an average of about 25% in the Lutheran tribe. You get into Episcopalians and some other cultures we work with, it's much lower than that. Any questions, thoughts about who you are that took this? Does it feel like it reflects you? Okay. Now, this is very important for you to understand, because we're going to be looking at a bunch of numbers and data. Our feeling is they're not numbers, and it's not just data, but it's stories. It's you and your experience that influences how you choose to respond to a statement. So that is a high value for us, because we have 182 people who've weighed in on their experience and feelings about this church and its culture. So those are stories. So we want to make sure that we don't just look at them as numbers and just statistical data. There's stories here. So here's what we look at. We bring a certain kind of logic to the numbers. First of all, we look for strong affirmation. So what we do is differentiate very clearly the difference between agree and strongly. This is not your data. So don't get caught up in this slide. So, we want strongly agree. We bias this because we want people to be what we call fist pumpers. And so, if you ask a 5-year-old, do you like ice cream? And they go, yeah. That's a yes, right? But it's not what you would expect from a 5-year-old. They think, yes. Where is it? We believe that church culture, when it's healthy and effective, should have fist pumpers, because that's what they want. They want their people who experience this to just be, yes, this is awesome. And even though you identify perhaps in some way as Lutheran, and maybe Lutherans don't share emotion all that well, you can still fist pump your fist, and we'll see that. So we look for fist pumping. So agree is not strongly agree. Now, another thing to this factor is with church culture, especially, we know that fundamentally, it's hard to say you don't like something about your church. If you love your church, you love being a part of this, it's very difficult to say we don't like it. So that's why we weigh heavily on this agree versus strongly agree, because there's a big difference. If you know what, I don't quite agree with that, but I just can't get myself to not agree. We'll talk more about that as we go along. So the second piece is we measure the direction. So a friend of mine who is, his name is David Looks. He's a well-known author. He's a senior pastor in the Twin Cities, good friends. Did a lot of research when he was in the seminary working. And he said, in all the research we did, all the studies we did, we found that no matter what survey you sent out, at least half the people will agree. At least half, almost always. So I'm like, okay, if that's the case, we want to pay attention to that. And we want to know, well, what happens to the data if that isn't in play? Where does it go? So if it goes to the left on our data, then that moves you to, well, I can't say yes, but I don't want to say no. Remember I said, if you love your church, but your statement is kind of, you can't say yes to it, you just don't want to say no. So I'll say neither agree or disagree, because that's a little safe. But if you want to say yes, you really believe it's true, boom, you're going to fist pump and say strongly agree. So we pay attention, where does the data go from that? If half people at least say yes, where does that data go? It really matters. Then we pay attention to the undecided. So that is, if any of you are politicians, a month before election day, who do you pay attention to? The undecideds. And the reason is because what happens to them next is important. It can move them to go to the right, or it can move them to go to the left and be a no. So when we have a strong presence of undecideds, that is for us to pay attention to that and say, well, what would be needed to move them to the right? And then the last thing is just, we have created this called there's a name for this, the graph. Area graph, I think. But it shows the distribution. It gives you a good visual. I'm a very visual person, so when I see the result and see that visual, I immediately know how that answer is playing out, that statement. So, little fun here. This is called the MAP. It's an acronym, obviously, MAP, Missional Assessment Profile. Well, we wanted to give you an understanding of every congregation is in the promised land. You know, you're not trying to get there, you are already there. The question is, where are you within that promised land? Where you are trying to live faithfully to God's call and mission for you, where are you in that? So I had an artist friend design my own content. So this is our map content. And there are 4 distinct areas or landscapes within that continent. And so they're stationary, nostalgic, puzzled, and possibility. So stationary. This is a landscape that you can find yourself in, and it's where the ministry is happening, but it doesn't feel like much movement or growth is being experienced. So this location says we feel stuck. We're not sure where we should go. But we don't hate it. There's not a lot of energy, so we just kind of sit on the porch, have coffee, and enjoy the scenery. Nostalgia. This landscape is a place where the church is enjoying a time of comfort in what they have done. Look at us, you know, the kudos to us, our legacy, but doesn't show much enthusiasm for taking those next steps into the future. Again, this is way more an example of, and this landscape, you can't really tell, but it's North Dakota and South Dakota. It's the farm country that I know. Different than the egg country here, but you sit on your deck, you look out at the landscape, and what you know, the view is so beautiful. Why would we want to do anything else? This is just great, and that happens a lot. It's in the Midwest we get called out for this, that we're comfortable. We don't have a lot of energy, but we're satisfied and comfortable. So puzzle. This is. As an identity issue. It's not clearly knowing who or what they are, while at the same time having a lot of desire to start making something happen. So there's energy, there's enthusiasm. We know we need to be doing something, but we have no clue what it is. And so this landscape is the Mississippi Delta, where you have a lot of options, and you have no information available to tell you which option is the right one. How many of you have ever read anything about the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery? So what happened when they came to a fork in the river? They had to be very clear and understand which one was the Missouri, which one wasn't, because if they didn't, they got screwed anyway, because they ended up knowing. But you have to know. So this is energy. We know we want to do something, we just don't have the information or understanding and clarity of what or why. The land of possibilities. This is where ministry is making bold decisions. They are doing things to advance their mission, exciting new ways, and they say, let's get going. They have clarity, a sense of purpose. There's energy, enthusiasm. This is the mountaintop experience landscape where you can see it all in front of you, and you're ready to go and take advantage of the opportunity. So, with all of that said, what landscape is Christ Lutheran Church of Visalia, California in?
Possibility.
Oh, you think you're all that, huh? Possibilities. Wow. You think so? You ready for the great reveal? Because your consultant gets to decide which landscape I think you're in. So this is my decision based on the data, not just random. Here you go. You are in the land of possibilities. However, there are things you need to pay attention to. You know, when you start thinking you're all that, what can happen? You can get into nostalgia very quickly. So you got to be careful to pay attention to where some of those vulnerabilities are and where you're not necessarily taking advantage of opportunities that are there for you. So let's get into the data and start assessing why I would have put you in the land of possibilities, where are some of those places you want to pay attention to. and how your people feel about your culture. Remember the logic again, and I'll be saying it to you over and over and over. So, this first statement, I feel a greater sense of the purpose of this congregation. Key to this statement is, the more I participate. And how do you feel about this answer? Remember I said, in any survey, at least half say yes or agree? So you got about 50% that say yes. But where does the rest of the data go? To the right? So you got some fist pumpers that when they look at that statement, they say yes, absolutely. And I want to tell you, I was telling Brian, most of my clients, if I was sitting in a worship service like that and it was going along like it was, I'd be going, all right, what's going on? Come on. I said, it felt so wonderful being in that space this morning. I was at 9:30, just seeing the community and how you wrap your arms around this culture. Those seniors, the confirmands, just the whole thing didn't feel like wasted time. It felt like so important and valuable. And that is a gift that you have and I experienced, because most of the church cultures that I'm in, and I travel all over the country, it's like, we got to get out of here. And I didn't feel that at all, because there's just so much love. So this is a huge reflection of that. In this congregation, I am part of something bigger than myself. Again, huge affirmation. The data, other than the half agree, is way to the right. You can fist pump. Give yourselves a hand. You fist pump. You know how to show emotion. Good job. Now, I would describe this congregation as a cohesive community. So what's changed? Not a lot of fist pumping, but we're right into that. At least half say sure. Because we differentiate between sure and yes. So sure is not yes. Sure is okay. And then you get some that can say, you know what, I just can't say yes. Now, remember, none of this is negative. All we want to say is, what might influence you in not being able to say yes to that? Or to fist pump to that? Is there something that is stirring, or, maybe you could, a lot of churches now that we're working with try to blame COVID on everything, which is, it's not unfair, but it's not always true. The culture was there before COVID, and that still has a memory that's carried forward. So, again, what might be stirring to say, it's not as cohesive, and maybe nothing. Could be as simple as, we have an 8 o'clock, we have a 9:30 service, and we never see each other, whatever. It could be that simple. I don't know the answer. I see myself as an integral part of this congregation. Now this, again, the data does what? Primarily, it's more to the left, right? And what I want to say to church cultures is, as you think of 21st century church, the hope the church has, in my opinion, is that we are better able to empower and equip all people in that faith community to see how vital they are to the living out of the mission. For a long time, churches lived vicariously through staff, through other leaders. You say, well, we have this core of volunteers and we can't get new ones in, but we still live vicariously through you because we think you have a great church. I'm not doing much, but they are, and I love that. This is a huge part of church for the future, to know how to make people not only feel, but be integral to living it out. And that's a lot easier said than done, but it's important. How are we doing with the logic? Are we making sense? Look at this. I believe this congregation is making a difference in people's lives. You know what? People can say, yes. That is awesome. You know how many churches I work with where that is the reverse? It's sad. This is an awesome result. That you have the highest percentage able to pump their fists. I like telling others about what is going on in this congregation. This is classic Lutheran culture response. We love what's going on here, but okay then, how about if we do? Let's see what happens. Participating in this congregation energizes me. So this is, again, a strong result because other than half, it goes to the right. But again, remember, here's where your opportunity is here, in that 52%. Because they're saying, sure. But that means there's room to grow and create more excitement and energy because you're saying, sure. Now, you can disagree with me, and that's fine, but I'm a consultant, and I'm doing the presentations or whatever. So, remember, I'm friends with Brian. So, that is opportunity. And the opportunity isn't to take somebody from disagree to strongly agree. That's not going to happen. That's too big of a jump. But if you want to move somebody from neither agree, I'm not sure, to assure, to being yes, that's much easier. But you got to know what it is that can do that. But you're in a very strong place. I invite people to participate in this congregation's worship experiences. Okay then. There's room to grow in your enthusiasm about what's going on in the place you call your favorite community. So here's what we do. We look at, you're in this landscape of possibilities, and I want to tell you, the warning sign for you, it's not warning, but the awareness sign is nostalgia. Okay? And as you think about and imagine leadership transition, this is going to be a danger zone for you big time, because you're going to look at a tenured pastor of 35 years. And all great, but the danger is to look back to wonder about what's next versus what has been to create now that positions you to imagine what's next. And that's a fine balance, but it's good to be aware of it. So what we do is we look at some what we call landmarks within your landscape. And therefore, the culture, ministry practice, readiness, and priorities. So, first is culture. What's happening in the culture, which is, what is that thing you experience when you come in the presence, and not just in this site, but whenever, like last night. I experienced your culture last night at Whitney Oak Tree Farm, Ranch, right? Yeah, and somebody was really cutting a rug. They had to take Tylenol, what, at 2 in the morning? I missed out on the rug cutting, sorry, I had work. So, 3 key things. Permeability. And permeability is a word we struggled with when we designed this. So, it's not having greeters at the door saying, welcome, because that's not permeating. It's how do I feel, how do you make me feel like I'm wanted here? I'm not wanted here for my butt in the pew or my bucks in the plate, but I'm wanted here to influence your culture, to bring my DNA into yours and value that. That's a big difference than having the greeters. Now, I'm not saying don't have greeters, but that's very different. So permeability, respect, and trust. So permeability, I feel like a valued part of this congregation. So here we have, I would say, a modest response, because you've got a good number of fist pumpers, but you have enough sures, and I can't say yes to this, to go, there's work we could do here. Remember I said integral back when that statement, I feel like an integral part of this mission, that one wasn't as robust as some others. Simply to me means we can pay attention to what might be wanting to happen to draw people into more of a sense of I'm important, I'm valued, I'm integral. It is easy to engage with the ministries of this congregation. Now, here's where you have the half saying sure. And what I would say is, I want to give you kudos, because I don't know if anybody saw a picture of me, Brian. You didn't have a picture of me anywhere, did you? Thank you. Appreciate that. But when I went to the ranch last night, for almost everybody I encountered took time to say, hi, my name's so-and-so, and it wasn't because of the bingo card. It was before I even got in there. And I'll tell you, I've been in churches in the Midwest especially, literally, I'm there to do some work as a consultant. I'm standing out in the narthex. I remember one time I stood in the narthex before church got out. Pastor came out, associate pastor came out, worship leaders, people came out. Not one person, not one, said hello. Not even just hello. Not even eye contact. Then I went down to their fellowship hour. Down the classic old Midwest church. You're down underneath the sanctuary, the fellowship hall. There were 3 women. I'm sorry, but you have to be 3 women, 4. So I literally sat down at the table and just sat there. 10 minutes, not one of them acknowledged. Not one. So you can imagine the work we had to do at that church about permeability, just feeling valued. But I'm giving you kudos. That is the exact opposite of what I experienced last night. And kudos to you that you don't know who I am. And people were really reaching out. Where's my cool hat guy with the red shirt? There he is. You were one of them. And we're walking in on the parking lot. Both of you said hi and gave me your name and asked for me. Those are the simple things. But anyway, how can you continue to deepen that? In this congregation, sharing a difference of opinion is welcome. So here's something's happened to the data. Again, now, you love this church. To say no to this is kind of a critique, right? To this culture. So it's hard to say no. But we have, 35% who cannot say yes to this. And at least almost half who just say sure. So, again, don't think negatively, but what in your experience do you have that would speak to why you can't say yes to this? Are you not asked? Is it not seen as a part of the culture? I don't know the answer. I'm going to find out perhaps when we do. I'm coming back in August to do some deeper listening with interviews and group sessions to learn more about you more qualitatively. But this to me says, what could we learn about that experience? Our congregation respects people with different views. Again, very similar, a little better, but pretty similar to those 2 answers, those statements. Okay, now please remember, you cannot look at this as a negative indictment on the culture. It's making you aware of what might be in play that we can put energy and resources or thought into that can change this trajectory so people move to the right. Thoughts, questions? None? Anybody have the winning lottery numbers? I got to play for you know how much a plane ticket is to Fresno? Sorry, I'm whining like crazy. That'd be $1,300.
Harry has a question. I have a question. It's a general question, but you said, are we working on how those things can be improved? I mean, suggestions for ways of making those things happen? Or are we just going to say, that's our culture? Or are we going to say...
No, I thought I would just come and disrupt. And I said, it's Brian's issue. I mean, it's his fault. No, it's why I'm here. Kudos to your leadership for knowing this is a very critical time. This helps us learn things that we're not going to say, oh, well, that's cool. But what do we need to do? What do we need to learn about it? So the next step for me, and there's another partner I have in this, Rick Heltney, who is the search guru that's going to be deployed on your behalf. But he wants to learn, more intimately about you to help become more informed about the kind of leader, but also the kind of culture. And we have a leadership leadership transition team. Can you raise your hands if you're here on that? Thanks to these 6 folks who've said yes to that. And if I was really good with names, I'd throw your names out, but I'm horrible with names, so let's just say the leadership transition team. They're tasked with taking this information, discerning, disseminating, and start to see what we need to pay attention to, how we can start crafting a sense of missional identity, purpose going forward, which is going to be a huge benefit to you as you start to think about what kind of leader, when that happens, will help to usher this culture forward. And that's going to be important, because I told the group last night, you're not just interviewing the candidate will be interviewing you when the time comes. And given the culture today where leadership is at a high value, that's an important thing. So we're going to work hard to make you look like, who do you want to look like? Prince? You know, I'm from Minneapolis. Okay. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
When making decisions, the leadership considers the perspectives of the congregation. So again, this isn't okay, a good response. This is a reflection of how you experience this happening. So maybe you don't get asked, but you're not offended that you haven't. Or it's not a part of your culture that we're going to, it's interesting that, you're highly educated. And that tends to be a different answer here, because you overreact on this. You get way too much input, way too much, 50 town hall meetings or whatever to discern and process. But maybe that's not your culture. I don't know. One of the other things that we are going to do, and Brian, I need to talk about this. It's called another assessment tool. It's called the Leadership Systems Inventory. We designed this. So we're going to conduct this with current staff and the past 5 years of council members. And it's to assess how the system moves, how decisions get made, how is communication done, what is your system in play in this culture. It's all different. And that'll help us get some insight into some of these statements that we're learning about here. That's going to happen sometime in the next 3 months or so. Okay? So, trust. Congregation leaders are open with decisions that are made. Leaders in this congregation manage the finances effectively. This is like the most important question if we're going to come into church and conduct a very significant capital campaign. And if this is a very stressed response, something's happened. There's been misappropriation of funds or something. It's a good response. I'd like it to be reversed. So think about that. Leaders manage the finances. I want those numbers reversed. So 28 agree, 53 strongly agree. That's a different response, if that makes sense, because there's just no question that we're confident and clear. And I'm not saying you're not, but this response just simply says, pay attention, be mindful. People need to be aware of how resources are being allocated. Really appreciated the gentleman who was doling out the scholarships. They're very transparent. And we didn't know amounts, but we knew the resources, where they're coming from. That's great transparency, helping people trust that the dollars they might have been giving to that are being used appropriately. And that's very important. When making decisions, the leadership considers the perspectives of the congregation. Again, it's a modest response. Just simply says, not a negative, but what does the culture do? What does the system do when it needs to make a decision? Does that make sense? I mean, the system is not you. The system is staff and council and wherever that authority's been given to move the ministry forward and make those decisions. We're good? Questions, thoughts? All right, ministry practice. Now for us, every congregation, whether they know it or not, has some sense of mission, some sense of purpose. They may not be able to articulate it very well. But the issue is, then, how do we do that? How do we live out this sense of our purpose so that we can accomplish those values, those things that we're committed to doing as a part of our mission? We call that ministry practice. And there's 5 areas we look at: faith integration, clarity of purpose, faith formation, connectedness, and inspiration. So faith integration, how well do you take what happens when you're here experiencing Bible study, worship, and be able to integrate it into your whole life? Because that's the hope. This isn't just a one and done kind of experience. This is holistic. So very strong. My faith informs my daily life. Awesome. Faith is a part of my entire life. That's the most robust answer you've got, right? 54% can fist bump. But overall, what about 91 can absolutely say yes to that statement. And that's good news, because remember I said, if you don't feel integral to the mission and ministry and the work, it's going to be challenging. This is a key part of it. My experience at church influences my daily life. That's pretty good. It's a little Lutheran-y, you know. Sure. I don't want to give it too much credit. But still, pretty strong. Clarity of purpose. What we do, how we live it out, is a reflection of what we feel our purpose is. What is our why? So, our sense of mission is an important component for decision making in this congregation. Very good, strong affirmation of that. Then you go, as a congregation, we have a clear sense of our purpose. Well, there, what I pay attention to is more people could say, yeah, sure, but I'm not really sure. And I want you to be really sure, especially in this next year or so, when we really want to go deep in discerning where is it you believe God's pushing you. You need to have a clear sense of that, and our work is to make sure we've got those numbers reversed. 50 to 60% could say, absolutely, we know what our purpose is. We know the kind of leader that we need to bring in here and move us, honor our legacy, and continue moving us into the future. That's going to be an important part of the work. The good part of the work, challenging part of the work. I believe in the mission of this congregation. That's a great starting point. So we don't have to work on people wanting to be a part of this. They already are wanting. They love this. You love this place. But now let's coalesce, energize ourselves, yourselves, to where is it we're going, and not get too caught up in the nostalgia, which can demote our ability. Faith formation, we look at 4 areas churches use. They use many more. We just chose 4. One is groups. Second is worship, education, and then mission kind of service outreach. Those 4 areas that churches typically use to try to live out that faith experience. My involvement in service through this congregation is important. So this is about value. Do you value these things? So you have, 81% overall say yes to this. And we look at this a little differently in terms of the yes and the strongly agree. Do you value? Yes. So there's 4 options you had. You're not going to choose all 4. You might choose 2 that are important to you or you value. So the way we look at this is if we can get 70% on average of agree and strongly agree, we know that's an affirmed area of focus for the ministry. So service is strong. Being a part of a group, that again is strong. That's 75% overall that agree and strongly agree. And we don't pay that much attention in terms of I can't say yes to that, simply because they don't value that part of that part of the faith formation. My experience with our congregation's worship plays an important role in nurturing my faith. Well, that's a very strong, almost 90%, and that's the one across the board throughout the country where that is typically the strongest. The next one is typically the lowest. It is the number one challenge faith communities have in understanding how to do faith formation through education, because it's radically changed. And we even were so alarmed when we were doing this early on. We did a whole workshop studying what's being presented as 21st century church culture education. And the book we ended up reading, we're like, nah, that just brought us back to the 20th century. And so we kind of bailed on it. It's a struggle. Most churches have agree or strongly agree in the 40% or lower. So you've got 50, was it 64? That's probably one of the strongest. So the kudos here is that whatever you're doing is valued. There's still room to grow, obviously. Relative to the rest of the church cultures out in the country, this is very strong. And most of the church cultures are. So then they do different kinds of things. Well, we'll meet in a microbrewery or something, and then do Bible study. You're still doing Bible study. So it's a deep challenge. Connectedness. I have developed and experienced meaningful relationships in this congregation. Well, I tell you, that's why I had such a great experience in worship this morning, because it was so evident that you are a family of different shapes and sizes, but you love each other, and it's very evident. That was a good experience to have in your worship. When we do ministry as a congregation, we are all on the same page. Well, there's a different sense of what does that mean. Are we all together? Are we invested? Are we valued in that? Are we integral to it? That comes into play here with this statement. So if you can tell now by a lot of these statements cross-pollinate to help us learn more about the culture itself. Inspiration. My involvement in this congregation inspires me. That's good. Again, not to lift up some of the woes out there in the church culture, but this is a very strong response. And the next one, the worship experience in this congregation inspires me, very strong. So those are great foundational pieces to build on. Knowing that there's some things to pay attention to, concerns, awareness about getting too comfortable, patting yourself too much on the back, but you have some strong foundational pieces here with your culture. Then readiness, and this is going to be important. You are going to experience change sometime in the near future, not the distant future, and thankfully Brian's been willing to let you have a heads up, this is what I'm thinking. And so let's do the work we need to do to be ready for that next thing. So how ready are you? Here's the challenge. Our congregation is willing to take risks to fulfill its mission. We got work to do here. Because you can't do 21st century church without taking risks. There are no answers until you try it. And if you're waiting for the answer, you won't try it. And then you're stuck where you're at. So this all involves risk. It's going to be a risk to invite a new leader into this faith community. Huge risk. Because you are a very strong, knit faith community, and you're going to invite someone into that. How permeable are you? How willing are you willing to risk your DNA getting influenced by somebody different? And no offense to Brian, but I don't think you're going to hire somebody Brian's age. I mean, maybe, if it was Jesus. But, so that means you're going to bring in a different generation. And that's risky. You know, a Gen X, millennial. I have 4 millennials. That's very risky. Those millennials. So, this is something you're going to want to work on. Just to say, you know what, we got to be more open to risk, not as failure and disappointment, but just growth and learning. New ideas are supported in this church. Again, this is where there's growth. Remember we talked about difference in opinions, and that those weren't as robust as we would like. Those all feed into, am I integral, am I valued, I have a different opinion. All of that stuff's going to come into play now as we work to form a sense of your why, the purpose you have moving into the future that's going to need and want a leader to help you do that and to walk with you. That's going to be important. And so different ideas are going to be flowing. How do you deal with that? How do we manage that? Challenges are seen as opportunities to grow. And this is, again, another growth statement here that says, if you avoid challenges, it's impossible to grow, because that's how you grow. And so how do we learn that failure is not defeat. It's growth opportunity, it's learning opportunity. Those are challenges. So, oh, we tried something, but it failed. But that isn't the end of it. That's a learn. What do we learn from that? And that's the way we can move into that sense of challenges are places to grow. And we'll see how that unfolds as we work and do this stuff together. Urgency. It is important that this congregation make changes in order to live out its mission. So in general, your culture would say, yeah, not so much. Which is, again, okay. But the danger here is the nostalgia piece of being comfortable. Because the truth is, culture is changing a lot faster than you are probably. And if you're not saying we need to change, then you don't wait around. Culture's not going to wait for you. So it's not like shame on you. It's just, well, we've got to pay attention because the world around us, culture's changing. All kinds of things are moving. And, in fact, our leadership team last night, I was asking, why would I want to move into Visalia? Or what is it about? You know, they were talking about people moving away, people moving in, the changes going on. And I said, that isn't why you shouldn't be doing ministry. All the things you just identified are why you should be doing ministry. So it doesn't matter what the challenges are that are the changes in those things. That just happens to be the context in which Christ Lutheran Church is in Visalia. And so what do we do about it? How do we embrace it? And we know we need to change. Well, is it important to change in the next 6 months? Well, the answer obviously is no, from your sense. But we're going to find out as we continue this work and learn and listen from you, what are some of those things that are wanting to happen that might call for change, might call for taking risks. I don't know what they are, but I do know that they might be out there. And that's okay. If we're afraid of them, that's a problem. If we can together, build each other up and take those challenges on, it can be life-giving. And worldview, this is our way of looking at theological landscape, not conservative, liberal, but how do you understand God's place in the world? That's called, from my understanding, that's what your worldview is. Where's God's place in that? I believe that God is active in the world today. So there's only one of you that's struggling with that one. So the rest of you are pretty clear. God is active. Even though the church might be in decline and there's struggles, God is still alive and present. That has not changed. There are ways to learn of God's truth outside of Scripture. Now, Brian and I have to have a conversation about this because Lutheran theology says absolutely. Scripture is just one way of learning about God's truth. There are other ways to experience God's reality, God's presence, God's truth. But you're pretty Lutheran here, so that's good. That yes, there is. And so, again, that doesn't mean you're right or wrong. It just means what your perspective is on how God is present in the world. God works through me. This one we want to, of course, be very robust because we believe it's true. If we don't, it's hard to live into mission and ministry. So, this last one is priorities. And here's what we did with this. We didn't want to list, I think we have 12 statements that you could say this is where church leadership or us should put energy. What we didn't want to do is have you think, well, then now that's our mission. These are the top 3, so now we got to do these. Instead, we wrote these to reflect a tendency of a culture. So if you said yes to this particular one, then that would reflect your concern for sustainability. Those statements, in our minds at least, reflect the culture's concern about its viability, its survival. The second tendency would be a statement that shows more of an interest in really assessing, are we making a difference? Are we having an impact? And that's way more helpful in terms of church growth, church movement, that you're concerned about impact, not just survival. And then the third is entrepreneurial, where you are a culture that absolutely is willing to roll up your sleeves, take risks, face challenges, perhaps experience failure. But to be entrepreneurial, if any of you are an entrepreneur, you know that you have to be able to deal with failure or deal with disappointments, because that's just how it is. So those are the tendencies, and here's how you came out. Now I know the writing is very small, but of the top 5, which we pay attention to, you have 1 that's entrepreneurial, 2 that are impact related, and 2 that are surviving or sustainable. Now I'm going to give you a free pass on the sustainable ones. Here's why, because I know you love this church. And of course, why wouldn't others? Why wouldn't you want others to come and experience something you love so much? So we need to attract more members, and we need to grow our worship. Those are when you love your church, of course you want those things to be important. Those are not strategies, those are wishes and hopes. So you just want more people in worship. You want more people, members. Those are hopes, those are not strategies. So then you move into impact, helping people experience God as the transformation force. We see that as impact. Exploring new and innovative ways to be church in today's culture. That's your second one. That one is the one we already spent a lot of energy around looking at. What does that look like? What does that look like for Christ Lutheran as it thinks about the future, thinks about new leadership for that future, thinks about defining its sense of purpose, mission. You already have a good sense of that, but how does that take clear form, and how does our understanding of what's going on in the culture around us going to inform what we do for ministry? So very strong. The good news is the bottom 2 are S's, which is recruiting more volunteers and motivating members to give. Of course you're going to say we don't need to do that because you're the one that would be getting motivated to give more. So we'll put that one down the bottom. Does that make sense? That's how we did the priorities. It's a reflection of where your mindset is. Are we concerned about our surviving? Are we concerned about how effective we are? Those kinds of things. So then what we do, this is just a basic tool about generosity, because we use this also with the Kairos work. Encourages me to be a good financial steward. We would love those numbers to be reversed, because we're stewardship ministry consultants. In terms of 19 agrees, strongly agree. It is important to give generously of my finances beyond my congregation. This is a must. If we're going to be resonating with the millennials, the Gen X or Gen Z, we can't just assume they should have loyalty to us. We should be one place in which generosity is lived out, but there are many places in which one can be generous and help make a difference in the world and the life of others, not just my church. What we have to do is have a compelling, convincing story of why this is a good place to share a resource, because we're making a difference, and we are helping to change the world for the better. Given what the church is doing now, I'm willing to give more or the same. That's a pretty typical response, but a good response that we got a decent percentage that are going to look at how they can give more to the church. And this is important for us in terms of what influences you when you make your decision to give. We want managing finances and economy to be the bottom 2. Because if those are the top 2, we've got problems. The only time economy was top was when I was working in Detroit at a church in Farmington Hills in 2008. 33% unemployment. It was one of the hardest economic hits Detroit had ever taken. So, of course, that was a huge influence on how we could do capital. And then this is where your giving or your income breaks down. And this is important to us more on the side of the development work, but lets us know what the socioeconomic kind of landscape is and how people are giving as a result of that. And then that's who you are. So, questions, thoughts? That's the data. This has been recorded, I believe, so it'll be available, because I know you're going to want to watch this. By which. There's also a hard copy PDF file that I'll give to Brian. of this PowerPoint, so you'll have the data. My team, the leadership team, will have the raw data before it gets thrown into the PowerPoint. But I just want to know if you have any questions, any thoughts. Does this feel like Christ Lutheran? Does this reflect what your experience is? Or does this leave you scratching your head? Yep.
And looking and talking about the assessments and thinking about the last 2 years at least, what percentage of these questions are the questions to get your data that you've used consistently over 5 or 10 years? I think what prompted me is thinking about leadership and the consistent leadership or the church board, pastoral, et cetera, 5 years versus 10 years. And I was thinking about how much of our responses and indicators could have been swayed by or impacted by COVID.
Right.
2 years of, so I guess my main question is, do you have generally used these same assessment questions to get data to understand way before COVID?
We designed this thing about 8 years ago, and then have adapted it as we've learned. What I can't say is we've learned anything yet on how COVID has impacted, the understanding of experiencing faith community, because we're just getting back into doing this with churches. My sense at this point would be we don't want to overstate the impact of COVID on church culture, but we don't want to dismiss it as it didn't really affect church culture. I don't know what the answer is yet, because we're still very new to being invited back into churches to do this work. I mean, literally, my 2 companies were dormant for about 18 months, except for churches that had a renewed balloon payment on a debt that they had to do with capital people. But so we're new into this. The last 4 months probably has been so we're going to meet actually in August to learn if we've discovered anything that we might need to pay attention to because of COVID. Yeah.
I'm curious, I guess 2 things. One, how many of these surveys have you done across the country? And my second question is, how many of these have been done where you've had a circumstance, and I mean this in a positive way, where the pastor, the senior pastor, has essentially initiated his own transition. And I'm curious how often you've seen that and how often you've done a survey where that has been a case.
So the first question is, we've done hundreds of these, and before we had the map, we were working with another organization that had an assessment tool that we had discovered, and then we kind of grew out of that one and designed our own. So we've done hundreds of these assessments. I think the second part of your question is, how often have we done it where the senior leader has initiated it, knowing they're transitioning out? That would be not very often. More often, we end up being in a culture working where the leader has decided to leave or decided to retire. Not because, a few times because we told them, you probably move on, because it was really, really dysfunctional. But
is that the case in this situation?
Yeah. I have yet to find out, but so far your data doesn't show it. But literally, there's been times where I've shown up, sat down, and within the first day, all I heard was, "How can you help us? We're a pastor," and that's very difficult because that's not what they hired me. But so, it's changing though. What Brian initiated is it's forward thinking.
Yeah.
It's got some courageousness to it because you're there and you're learning about what your DNA has been and culture. And so a lot of leaders aren't that self-aware and self-confident. They're a little more worried about what they'll learn about themselves. But that's changing. more because synods are less and less able to truly give the kind of support to church cultures in these transition movements. And they're starting to become more open to an outside agency like ours to be recommended as a service provider for them. Biggest challenge they have is they're very limited to the candidates they have. They only get to look at the candidates that have been submitted papers to that synod. They cannot go out and look for candidates outside of the pool. And that's just the way it is. That's the polity that's been created. When I was growing up, I was ALC. My dad was an ALC pastor, and that wasn't at all in play. Any bishop could go around anywhere in the country and say, "Hey, Joe or Judy, I think you'd be great at this church. You want to consider." Well, then when candidacies, candidates became less and less, the pool of candidates are small now compared to 1970, 1980, 1990. It's been shrinking ever since.
So that kind of leads me to another question, I guess in a sense of concern. So are you saying here today that the caliber of candidacies is very thin? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the pool of candidates where you would find high-level leader is much smaller than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago for sure. That doesn't mean they're not out there. What increases your potential of identifying is doing what Brian has encouraged you to do, which is not just bring me in, but Rick, who can go outside the box of the limitations of your synod and look around the entire country for candidates, and most importantly, candidates that aren't looking to move. The synod is really primarily inundated with candidates who want to move, so they submit papers. So if Brian wasn't retiring but wanting to move, he would have called his bishop and submitted papers saying, I'm looking to move, not to necessarily your bishop, but to a bishop in another synod or somewhere. So I'm giving you my papers to say I'd like to be considered in your synod for a call there. And that's the only people that the synod can look at. With Rick has a network around the entire country, and also, and we got to work on this, you have available 3 other denominations that are eligible candidates to receive a call within the ELCA. The Presbyterian Church, the Episcopal Church, and the Congregation UCC. Is that right, Brian? Is there another?
Moravian.
The Moravian Church, yes. And I have not experienced a Moravian candidate, but I've experienced a Presbyterian Lutheran culture where there was one pastor leading both in the same space as a faith expression. However, when I met with your council, I had said, is it okay if I share this, Brian? I had said, what's a non-negotiable? As you think about a leader in the future, what's a non-negotiable? It ended up, one individual said they need to be from a Lutheran seminary or have a Lutheran, what I call ethos. So I said, okay, but then we just shrunk our pool. But that's not a negative. Your pool still includes the entire country now, because Rick can go anywhere he wants to try to identify someone. But what I said, and Brian and I, we're going to work on this. I want to actually do this. It'll be fun. I want to meet with your leaders, the leadership, transition team, and council, and come up with a process to say, well, what does that mean? What does a Lutheran ethos mean in Christ Lutheran Church in Visalia? Because it'll be very different than what it means to Memorial Lutheran Church in downtown Madison, Wisconsin. So I thought it was a good question, good statement, something you want to pay attention to. It would be very helpful as you think about the kind of leader that can come in here. Now, whether you end up saying, well, they have to have a Lutheran seminary education, there's a lot of Lutheran pastors out there from Yale, Harvard Divinity School, from even Fuller and others that aren't Lutheran, but are, you know, they're very much into the Lutheran ethos,
So just to be clear, this fellow that goes around the country, the other guy, your counterpart,
so.
Rick, so he can actually identify and knows of people that are the caliber we want, and he can actually identify them and we can get in communication with them. Is that right?
Well, you don't, he doesn't turn it over to you. Rick is the one that does the connecting and interacting, because Rick's been working with your leadership. He'll be back with me next time to understand the kind of character, attributes, and he'll do that and work with the search committee or whatever you decide to call it. What we're going to do with Brian and some other staff is Rick conducts this personality assessment called motivational code. And so we're gonna diagnose Brian and just see what the heck is going on in that head. And what we want to avoid.
There's a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, right. So the purpose of that is to see what has motivated Brian in his work here that are attributes and assets that might be a part of what you want in another leader. That isn't going to be Brian, and we're also going to do it with, Brian's going to identify some other staff that we'll do that with as well. And then that will also be done with your identified candidate. Rick will also conduct the M-code with producing vetting. So, I mean, there are no guarantees, but you ramp up your capacity to find a good, viable candidate exponentially by doing it this way. The people are still people.
And just a final question, how often has this Rick done this current time? I mean, does he have 100, congregations he's a search for, or has he only done this a couple of times
Rick
outside
has
of the
done,
Senate?
well, he has never done one for Sierra Pacific, but he's done them for other Lutheran cultures. Bishops are just now starting to get comfortable with the fact that we're coming in and doing this. This is kind of invading their territory.
Yeah.
They're learning that it's going to be a value to them when they realize this is going to help their strong churches stay strong.
Yeah.
Because they can't do it. So, but Rick has done, I don't know, hundreds. He's worked at this for years, and he's not just churches, but faith-based ministries, nonprofits, executive leaders. So he's connected outside of the Lutheran tribe, which is helpful.
Good.
And the key for Rick is he works for a company that's called SEMA. They do not, so let's say Brian or me, I'm curious what's out there. I want to think about taking another call. They won't take their names. They don't want anybody in their queue that they sense wants to move. They want to be the ones who identify the leaders through their networks who aren't necessarily considering moving, because that to them is a much stronger candidate. Because you never know what's behind the desire to move. Yes?
How do we know that our Senate won't react negatively to us doing something obviously is a little innovative, since the pool is so small here, and we're choosing to go outside of that?
Well, my guess is, given some of the things going on in the city, they're not going to be too worried about what's going on. But I also would say it isn't going to be, it wouldn't be Megan anyway. It would be the bishop of whatever synod, the pastor candidate you found, saying, what the heck are you doing sheep stealing? That's likely, but who cares? I mean, literally, they're going to have to figure out, if healthy churches are going to stay healthy, this is how it's going to have to happen. And that's just the way it's going to be. I mean, that's what happens in the corporate world.
Are the results of this survey going to be presented to potential candidates or not?
We're going to do an onboarding process once your candidate is identified and called. Part of our contract is to do onboarding, which is to give that person entree into all of the good work that was done leading up to the process of identifying and calling them. So, yes, but not as a precursor to them deciding to come
But
here
at some point.
at some point.
I'm curious as to what extent, if at all, the community at large, in other words, the city of Visalia, in our case, is considered in any invite of a pastor or discussion with somebody you might be asking to come.
In terms of, for a call?
Just, the community itself. In other words, they may be interested in moving to a big city, but all of a sudden they're being asked to move to a small community in the middle of California.
Oh, so you're asking how much of a role does the actual Visalia
Yes, just
context?
in a very generalized way.
Well, I would say huge,
Yes.
but you can't do anything about that. I mean, there's nothing you can do to change that. Your job is, and I told the leadership transition team last night, our job together is to put a pretty good story together of why this is an awesome faith community. And you are. I don't think that's going to be a stretch. And that's got to be the primary reason why somebody wants to come. This is a healthy, high potential faith community. And it happens to be in Visalia. If you're going to try and sell it because you are in Visalia, and then you just happen to be a faith community. My dad, honestly, took one call for that reason. He wanted to live in the Black Hills of South Dakota because he wanted to hunt. And he took a call in Newcastle, Wyoming. The church folded its doors in 18 months because Newcastle, Wyoming had one oil well that drove the economy and it dried up. And everybody moved. And so my dad learned a lesson. Never move because of location, ever. And so, there might be somebody that wants to go hiking in the sequoias and be close to the mountains and loves 110 degrees and something like that. I don't know. I'm hoping they're out there.
So, given the demographics of the congregation and looking at the data that you have presented, and knowing that Pastor Brian has been with us for a long, long time, have you done the same kind of survey with a younger pastor, not been very long, has had a tenure of 10 years or something like that, and had pretty much the same result? I'm talking about a younger pastor, thinking that we're going to be bringing a younger pastor.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's many kinds of pastors. You have a pastor that's top down, that all things run through them. You have a culture that it's more of a bottom up. And so if you have a culture where it's more bottom up, or there's a lot of broad-based sense of ownership, it's not dependent on that pastor so much of what brings me joy, satisfaction, value, but it's the culture of the ministry. So yeah, absolutely. I've had great results at churches where the pastor's been there 5 years. What I pay attention to is if the pastor's been there less than 10 years, and we looked at that demographic of I've been here for 10 or more or 20 or more, and I got some more difficult responses, then I want to pay attention to what happened before this pastor showed up. Because it's not on their watch. It's on something else that might have happened, dysfunction. And if you have time to sit down with the bishop anywhere in this country, the saddest part of that conversation would be how much they deal with misconduct and dysfunction. I mean, it breaks your heart to know that that's primarily what bishops are spending their time with doing. And so if you have that happen and it's dealt with very poorly, it can affect that church culture for decades. But I don't see that here. It's good. Anything else? I know I've taken your time. I want to get up to see the large trees in the sequoia, which I've never seen before. So, if you have something you'd like to ask me, I'll be hanging out here. Feel free to tap my shoulder and ask me a question. Thank you. You're awesome. Celebrate. What a gift you have.